The silence between them was never empty. The wind rustled through the trees outside the studio lot in Burbank, where time seemed to move in slow motion that late afternoon. The sun had begun its descent behind the hills, casting a golden hue over everything, and there was something in that light, something nostalgic, something heavy with memory. Keanu Reeves stood near his parked motorcycle, leather jacket half-zipped, fingers absently toying with the worn zipper, his thoughts miles away. He wasn't thinking about the press interviews or the next script in his inbox. He was thinking about her, Sandra, the woman whose presence had always left a trace on him, like the lingering warmth in your chest after a deep laugh or the shadow of a melody you can't quite place but still feel. They hadn't worked together in years, but she never really left his life, not in the way that mattered. They'd kept in touch, yes, in the occasional text or rare phone call. But there was always something unspoken between them, a tension not built on discomfort, but on familiarity that had never dared cross a line. That line, Keanu feared, had become a wall over the years, one that neither of them knew how to scale without shattering something precious. It all began months earlier, in the quiet corner of a Toronto cafe where Keanu had escaped during one of his brief respites from the Hollywood machine. He had always loved Canada's ability to breathe room into him, to give him space from fame's crowded expectations. The cafe was dimly lit with rustic charm, the kind of place that served coffee with handwritten notes of encouragement slipped under the saucer. That day he sat alone at the far table, back to the window, sipping black coffee and leafing through a worn paperback. The pages blurred in front of him, though, because his mind wasn't on the words. His phone had buzzed just minutes earlier, and the name that lit up the screen was one he had memorized long ago, Sandra Bullock. There was no message, just a missed call, and he hadn't called back yet. He stared at the screen like it held a question only he could answer. Why now? Why her voice after months of quiet? The truth was, he had rehearsed 1,000 conversations with her in his mind, but the real ones always caught him unprepared. They were either too casual or too brief, always dancing around the edges of something more meaningful. He was tired of the dance. Sandra, too, was struggling with a weight she couldn't quite name. She had spent the better part of the last few years devoted to family, to raising her children, to embracing a life away from the spotlight that had once defined her. The glitter of Hollywood had faded into the background, and in its place was a deeper hunger for truth, for connection. She had been thinking about Keanu more than usual lately, and not because of any tabloid story or nostalgic rewatch of Speed. It was something subtler, more haunting. A quiet ache that surfaced whenever she found herself alone in the house, her thoughts drifting to that unguarded moment on the set of the lake house, where he had looked at her with a softness she never forgot. He never said anything, of course. Neither did she. But the moment lived between them like a shared secret, a single note in a song that never resolved. So when she called him that day, it wasn't random. It was instinct. She didn't leave a voicemail, didn't text afterward because she didn't know what to say. How do you tell someone that time has only made your feelings more confusing, not less? How do you confess that the spaces between the conversations are the ones that speak the loudest? That night after Keanu didn't return her call, Sandra stood by her kitchen window, watching the moonlight spill across the countertop, and wondered if she'd imagined everything. If the connection she felt was just nostalgia wrapped in loneliness. But somewhere deep down, she knew better. She knew his silence wasn't absence, it was hesitation. 2 weeks passed. Keanu had meant to call, but the words never came. He kept opening his contacts, his thumb hovering over her name before locking the screen again. He hated that about himself, the overthinking, the reluctance, the fear of messing up something beautiful. But time has a way of forcing action when you least expect it, and fate, as it often does in stories worth telling, stepped in through an unexpected invitation. A reunion event. Not a formal one, not some polished awards ceremony. Just a quiet charity gathering in downtown Los Angeles, where former cast and crew from several beloved films were being invited to read letters from fans and reflect on the impact their movies had made. The organizers reached out to both Sandra and Keanu separately. Neither knew the other had accepted, until the morning of the event. Sandra arrived first, dressed in a soft navy blouse and jeans, elegant yet effortlessly grounded, her hair swept in a way that made her look like time hadn't touched her since her blind side days. Keanu walked in 30 minutes later, helmet in hand, and froze when he saw her across the room. She hadn't seen him yet, and in that suspended moment he let himself look, really look. She was laughing with a fan, completely present, completely her. The years had etched more grace into her, not less. And suddenly the wall inside him cracked, not shattered, but fissured just enough to let courage leak through. Their eyes met as she turned around, and the familiarity hit like a tidal wave. No words at first, just a smile that spoke in paragraphs. He walked up, slow and hesitant, but she stepped forward without hesitation and pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than it should have. In that embrace, something shifted, something quiet but undeniable. It wasn't just reunion, it was recognition. They spent the event sitting side by side, taking turns reading letters from fans who talked about how their chemistry on-screen helped them believe in love again, in kindness, in redemption. One letter stood out. A woman who had lost her husband to cancer and said watching the lake house every year helped her feel connected to him, that the movie reminded her love could stretch across time and silence and distance. Sandra's hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter. Keanu looked over, touched her wrist gently, and for a moment they didn't need to speak. The silence between them had never been empty. It had always been full of things they were too afraid to say. After the event, they walked out together into the crisp evening air. No paparazzi, no fans, just two souls standing in the glow of a moment too important to ignore. Sandra leaned against the brick wall, her arms folded but her eyes soft. Keanu stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, staring at the sky like it had answers. He exhaled slowly, then turned to her. "You ever wonder," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "what would have happened if we said what we really felt back then?" She didn't look away, all the time. And in that second, everything changed, not with a kiss, not with some dramatic declaration, but with honesty, raw, imperfect honesty. For the first time in years, Keanu didn't hold back. He stepped forward, closer than ever before, and let the truth escape him, fragile and unfiltered. "I wasn't brave enough then," he said, eyes not leaving hers. "But I've thought about you every year, every film, every silence, and if I don't say it now, I don't think I ever will." Sandra's breath caught in her throat. There were tears she didn't expect, laughter that trembled at the edge of disbelief. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she reached for his hand, and when their fingers touched, it felt less like a beginning and more like coming home. That night they didn't rush, they didn't define anything, but they knew the path had changed, and the story that had waited in the quiet corners of their lives for decades had finally begun to speak. A heart that waited quietly. The night after the reunion event lingered in Sandra's thoughts long after she returned home. Her house, normally a haven of peace, felt strangely electric, charged with the weight of what was said and the even heavier presence of what hadn't been. She lay on the couch wrapped in a throw blanket, the soft flicker of a candle throwing shadows across the walls as her mind replayed Keanu's words like a melody she couldn't stop humming. "If I don't say it now, I don't think I ever will." It echoed again and again, not as a confession, but as an unsealing. She'd waited years for something like that, not just from him, but from life itself, something vulnerable. Something that cracked the surface of what people pretended to feel and exposed the raw tenderness beneath. And now she felt something terrifying, hope. Not the loud, cinematic kind that demanded a kiss in the rain. No, this was quieter. The kind of hope that tiptoed in during the quiet moments and made you rethink every guarded decision you made in the name of survival. Keanu, too, wasn't the same man who had walked into the charity event just hours before. As he pulled into the garage of his modest house tucked away in the hills, he parked the bike and didn't move for several minutes. The engine clicked as it cooled, and his breath misted slightly in the cold. But it wasn't the weather that had him paralyzed. It was the realization that for the first time in years, he had been emotionally honest with someone who mattered, truly mattered. Not a fan, not a friend on set. But Sandra, the one person who had consistently lived in the periphery of his emotional world, bright as sunlight yet always untouchable. He didn't know what would happen next. And perhaps that's why it felt real. There was no script to follow, no scene partner to rehearse with. Only him and her and the unfolding story of a connection they had both denied for far too long. The days that followed were quiet, almost deceptively so. They didn't rush into endless phone calls or confessions. Instead, they existed with a newfound awareness that something between them had shifted. They didn't label it. Keanu didn't send roses. Sandra didn't bombard him with texts. It was subtler than that. She sent him a photo from the event, a candid shot someone had taken of them laughing as they read a fan letter together. Keanu responded with nothing but a heart emoji and a silent message only the two of them could understand. "We're still us." But beneath that calm surface, both were navigating storms of emotion they had avoided for years. Sandra found herself walking longer routes with her dog, as if the movement might quiet the ache building in her chest. She replayed old interviews, revisiting moments she had shared with Keanu in public and wondering how many times they had both deflected real emotion with a joke or a polite laugh. There was one interview in particular, years ago when they were both guests on a talk show, and the host had asked them if they had ever been romantically involved. They had both laughed, saying the timing was never right. But now, with time no longer a luxury, she wondered if wrong timing was just an excuse for fear. Because the truth was, she had loved parts of him for decades. Not in the fairy tale, candlelit dinner sort of way, but in the way you quietly admire someone who consistently chooses kindness in a world that rewards cruelty. Keanu, on the other hand, had thrown himself back into the world of motion and stillness, the rhythm of the motorcycle rides, the solitude of sketching, the comfort of reading dog-eared books alone in his kitchen. But none of it soothed the restlessness. Not anymore. His conversations with himself grew louder, more direct. For years, he had convinced himself that people like him didn't get to have the kind of love others dreamed of. He had seen too much loss, carried too many ghosts. He had buried a child, lost a partner, lived through grief that pressed against his ribs like an old injury every time he tried to feel something more. But Sandra, she made him feel more, and that scared him. One evening 2 weeks after the event, Sandra sent him a voice message. Not a call, not a video, just her voice, tired but honest. I don't know what we are or what we're supposed to be, but I do know that I've spent years telling myself stories about you, and none of them were ever about regret, but I don't want to add any now. She paused. I guess I'm just saying I'm here if you are. Keanu listened to that message while sitting on the back porch, the stars bright above, the world quiet. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat with her words like one sits with grief or joy, slowly, reverently. Then he did something unexpected. He took out an old notebook he hadn't touched in years and began to write. Not a letter, not a script, but a confession, stream of consciousness thoughts that flowed like water from a well long sealed. Words like, I always looked for you in every character I played, and you're the only silence that's ever made me feel full instead of alone. He wrote for hours. Then he folded the pages, put them in an envelope, and left them on his desk. But before he could find the courage to send it, Sandra showed up at his door. It was unannounced, a risk, a leap. She wore a simple hoodie and jeans, no makeup, hair pulled back, but her eyes were certain. Keanu opened the door, stunned, the letter still in his hand, and for a moment neither spoke. The vulnerability in the space between them was so thick it might have crushed someone else. But not them, not now. She saw the envelope, read the weight in his eyes, and whispered, Is that for me? He nodded. She didn't take it, not yet. Instead, she walked past him into the house, her hand grazing his as she passed. The contact sent shivers up his spine. They sat in the living room, quiet at first. Then Sandra looked at him and asked the question they had both feared for years. Why didn't we ever try? Keanu's answer was simple, painful, and true. Because I didn't think I deserved you. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. And I thought you saw me as a friend who made you laugh, nothing more. I saw you as the one person who always understood me without asking me to explain, he replied. I just never knew how to show it without ruining everything. The moment wasn't dramatic. There was no orchestral swell or sudden embrace. But it was real, and that made it beautiful. Sandra finally took the letter, opened it slowly, read in silence. When she finished, her hands trembled slightly and tears welled up, but not from sadness, from clarity. I waited a long time to hear these things, she said. But I'm not angry, because I think we needed to become the people we are now to understand what we meant back then. Keanu nodded, and now? Sandra smiled. Now we take our time, but no more pretending. He reached for her hand. No more pretending. Outside, the world kept spinning. The night deepened. But inside that quiet home, something rare had happened, not a fairy tale, but something better, a real beginning. And for two people who had spent a lifetime performing other people's truths, they were finally ready to live their own. Between the lines, they never spoke. There are moments in life so quiet, so delicate, that they almost go unnoticed if not remembered with care. For Keanu and Sandra, the days that followed were filled with these moments, not loud declarations or sweeping gestures, but small, seismic shifts in how they saw the world, and more importantly, how they saw each other. It began with coffee. Not metaphorical, not romanticized, just a simple, grounded cup of coffee that Keanu made for Sandra the morning after she had read the letter. He didn't say anything as he handed it to her in the chipped ceramic mug she had once complimented years ago on a random shoot. He just set it down next to her with the ease of someone who had finally accepted the presence of another soul in his private world. She sipped in silence, eyes following the steam that curled upward, and something in her settled. There was no performance here, no need to impress or keep up appearances. It was just them, older, rower, and infinitely more honest. They didn't call what they were doing dating. They didn't label their slow reunion with terms like rekindled love or late-in-life romance. That would have cheapened it, put a commercial bow on something that had taken decades to grow in the shadows. Instead, they treated their connection like a fragile heirloom, carefully unwrapping it piece by piece, studying the parts they had ignored, polishing the corners dulled by time and distance. They took long walks in places no one recognized them. Sometimes they spoke about everything, childhood, movies, lost years, and sometimes they walked for hours without exchanging a single word. It didn't matter. Keanu had always believed that silence was a form of language, and Sandra had grown to love how he listened with his eyes more than his mouth. But still, healing is never a straight line, and even love, when reintroduced after years of suppression, comes with unexpected turbulence. It was a Tuesday afternoon when it happened, the first real rift since they had begun this delicate journey. They were in Keanu's house discussing a script Sandra had been offered. A beautiful story one she was tempted to accept, but the catch was that the shoot was in Rome, 3 months. Abroad. Sandra brought it up gently, as if testing the temperature of a new sea, but Keanu's response wasn't what she expected. He went quiet, too quiet, not contemplative but closed off as if a wall had suddenly been re-erected. Sandra, sensitive to silence in ways most people aren't, felt the shift immediately. "Say something," she urged, her voice laced with concern more than confrontation. Keanu stared at the floor, his fingers grazing the edge of the table. "You should go," he said flatly. She tilted her head, confused. "I didn't say I was going, I said I was thinking about it." "I know," he replied, eyes still cast downward. "But I don't want to be the reason you don't." That's when Sandra realized the depth of his fears. This wasn't about Rome. It wasn't even about the film. It was about the old wounds of being left, of losing someone again, of attaching his heart to something that might once again vanish. And that's when she understood. Keanu hadn't just been surviving all these years. He had been bracing for loss every day, even in moments of joy, especially in moments of joy. She reached across the table, gently lifting his chin until their eyes met. "Keanu, I didn't come back into your life just to leave again, but I also didn't come back to stop being who I am. I want to do this with you. That means sharing the scary parts too, like distance, like doubt." He nodded, the tension in his shoulders loosening like a string finally unknotted. "I'm not used to being someone people stay for," he whispered. "Then get used to me," she whispered back. It was not a perfect fix. It didn't erase decades of emotional conditioning or soften the harsh echoes of abandonment that still lived in the corners of Keanu's soul. But it was real. And realness, they both knew, was more powerful than promises. As the days wore on, Sandra helped him in ways she never could have when they were younger, because now she understood. She understood the trauma hidden in his silences, the grief tucked beneath his steady gaze. She didn't try to fix him. She simply stayed, brought him soup when he was under the weather, left notes in the books he was reading, played him obscure records from her teenage years, and danced barefoot in his kitchen until he laughed despite himself. Keanu, in return, showed her what it meant to be cherished without being needed. He never asked her to abandon her dreams. He never claimed her time. Instead, he built his life around presence, being there when she needed grounding, holding space when she needed air. And slowly, without either of them realizing it, a rhythm began to form. They went grocery shopping together without a fuss. They watched old black and white films in their pajamas. They hosted a dinner for a few close friends who were stunned to find them not as Hollywood icons, but as two people quietly in love. No declarations were made. No cameras captured the moment. But those who were there knew they had witnessed something sacred. Two people who had defied the odds of time and silence to meet each other exactly where they were. Then came the invitation. An interviewer from a respected magazine reached out, hoping to do a feature piece on iconic cinematic duos and their personal reflections. It wasn't gossip-focused. It wasn't invasive, just a deep dive into legacy, chemistry, and the kind of connection that translates on screen. Sandra was hesitant. She had grown wary of public perception. Keanu, too, had spent a lifetime avoiding the glossy spotlight of romantic speculation. But this felt different. This felt like an opportunity to control the narrative, to show the world a version of them that wasn't manufactured by rumor, but shaped by truth. After much deliberation, they agreed. The interview would be conducted at Keanu's home, intimate and free of PR handlers or studio agendas. The journalist, a woman in her early 40s who had grown up watching Speed on VHS, arrived with reverence and professionalism. She asked beautiful questions, thoughtful, probing, and gentle. At one point, she leaned in and asked, What is it, do you think, that made your chemistry so enduring? Sandra smiled, eyes flicking toward Keanu. We never tried to create chemistry, she said. We just never interrupted what was already there. Keanu nodded. There's a kind of silence between people who trust each other that says more than dialogue ever could. We had that. We still do. The journalist paused, pen hovering. So are you saying you two are together now? Keanu and Sandra exchanged a glance. No smirks, no giggles, just a quiet affirmation that needed no explanation. We're in a place, Sandra said, where labels feel too small for what we're building. After the interview, they sat outside as the sun began to fall, wine glasses in hand. And Keanu looked at her the way a man does when he finally believes he's allowed to feel safe. I keep waiting to wake up, he confessed. Sandra leaned her head against his shoulder. Then don't sleep. And for once, he didn't. The echo of almosts. Time, when experienced through the lens of rediscovered love, moves differently. It stretches in quiet moments and blurs during the ones that matter most. For Keanu and Sandra, the weeks following the interview were both a return and an awakening. There was a curious intimacy in being seen not by the world but by each other, in ways neither of them had been before. They didn't speak about the article after it was published. They didn't need to. The piece went viral, yes. Fans called them soulmates, media outlets speculated once again, hashtags trended for days. But none of it mattered, not really. Because the truth they shared wasn't performative, it wasn't made for the screen or the headlines, it belonged to them. It lived in their glances, in the quiet cups of tea before dawn, in the books they passed to one another without a word. And yet in the privacy of that sacred stillness, something unresolved hovered, unspoken, patient, waiting. One morning, Sandra awoke before the sun. She padded barefoot into Keanu's kitchen, the wooden floors cool beneath her feet. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with traces of him, the sketchbook he'd left open on the counter, the motorcycle gloves beside the door, the faded hoodie draped over the chair where he often sat to read. She picked it up, held it to her chest for a moment, and allowed herself to feel the enormity of everything they'd been to each other over the years. Friends. Co-stars, strangers, mirrors, and now? What were they now? It was a question she hadn't dared speak aloud. Not because she didn't feel secure, but because some truths, when rushed, collapse under the weight of definition. That morning, as she stepped outside into the faint light of dawn, she saw Keanu sitting on the porch steps, elbows on knees, eyes trained on the horizon like a man waiting for something he couldn't name. She joined him in silence, shoulder to shoulder. For a while, they just watched the light shift across the sky. Then he turned to her, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently, and said something that froze the moment in time. I've been thinking about the future. Sandra turned her head slightly, her breath catching in the subtle gravity of his tone. What about it? He looked down at his hands. I'm not afraid of being alone anymore, but I am afraid of building something beautiful with someone and losing it all over again, because that would shatter me. It wasn't a confession, it was a plea, not for reassurance but for understanding. She took a slow breath, letting the truth settle around them. You're not alone in that fear, she said quietly. I've lost too, not just people, but pieces of myself along the way. I've lived years pretending I didn't want something deeper because wanting meant risking. And risk, especially at this point in our lives, feels bigger. Keanu's eyes met hers, and for a fleeting second she saw the boy he once was, the one who had loved with reckless abandon before the world taught him how fragile love could be. I don't want to lose you, he admitted, but I also don't want to live halfway. That was the moment, not a proposal, not a plan, but a crossroad of emotional honesty. One where they both stood bare in front of each other, letting every scar and every longing be seen. And from that raw truth, they made a decision, not to move fast, not to define, not to retreat, but to create a space where love could breathe without fear. So they traveled, not to Paris or Rome or some romanticized escape, but to the places that had shaped them long before fame rewrote their names. Sandra took him to her childhood home in Virginia, a quiet place on a hill, now owned by distant relatives, but still filled with echoes of her laughter and sorrow. They stood on the old porch where she used to sit with her mother, and she told Keanu stories she had never shared with anyone, about the nights she used to cry herself to sleep after her mom died, about the guilt she felt over moving away, about the journals she burned when her heart was broken for the first time. Keanu didn't try to console her. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply held her hand and listened, his presence like a weighted blanket grounding her to the moment. Then it was his turn. He took her to a small cemetery in Westwood where his daughter's name was etched on a simple headstone beneath a maple tree. He hadn't been there in years, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't believe he deserved peace. But with Sandra beside him, he knelt, touched the stone, and whispered an apology so soft it felt like wind. Sandra stepped back, giving him space, and let the tears fall silently down her cheeks. Later, when he returned to the car, eyes red but spirit lighter, he said only one thing: "You were the first person I ever wanted to bring here." They didn't need to explain why. Some places, some people are only meant for the deepest truths. Back in Lowe's Angels, they settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that no longer avoided the question of what are we, but instead embraced the answer: we are becoming. They began writing a story together, not a screenplay, not a memoir, but a shared document on Keanu's old laptop, a private journal where they each wrote entries to the other without speaking them aloud. Some were memories, others were fears, many were dreams. It became their bridge, a way to express without pressure, to reflect without response. In one entry, Sandra wrote, "I used to think you were the quietest person I knew. Now I realize you're just the one who listens the most." And that's louder than words. Keanu, in return, wrote, "You've always been light, even when you didn't know it. You walked into every room like you were holding someone else's sadness just to make it easier for them. I see you now, and I won't let you carry it alone anymore." They didn't talk about the future with a timeline, but the way they planned small things, a garden, a road trip, a visit to Keanu's sister in Maui, began to whisper of permanence. And then came the evening that solidified everything. It was late. The city outside was humming its usual noise, but inside Keanu's home, the world was still. They were sitting on the couch, reading separate books, legs gently tangled. Sandra closed hers, looked over at him, and said, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if we had done this 20 years ago?" He set his book down, considered for a long moment, and then said, "We weren't ready then. You were chasing the sky. I was running from my past. We would have hurt each other." She nodded slowly, "But now." Keanu looked into her eyes, no hesitation, no guard. "Now I want to stay." And in that moment, she leaned in, not out of impulse or cinematic timing, but because it was time. Their lips met softly, as if asking permission from the years they had missed. It wasn't passionate in the theatrical sense. It was sacred, a sealing of decades' worth of unsaid emotion, a promise that they were no longer living in the echo of almosts. Where the light stayed longest. There are seasons in life that don't match the calendar, personal seasons, silent shifts in the soul that arrive without warning and leave everything changed. For Keanu and Sandra, that season had finally arrived. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It unfolded like morning mist lifting over a still lake, quiet, certain, and impossible to ignore. They had stepped into a chapter that neither had dared imagine for so long that the very reality of it felt like poetry whispered beneath their everyday moments. And yet, as peaceful as it appeared from the outside, the truth of love, real love, is that it doesn't simply exist. It asks, it reveals, it confronts. And over the next few weeks, love did all of that. Their shared nights grew slower, more intentional. They cooked together, Keanu often quiet behind the stove, Sandra humming old songs as she chopped vegetables or set the table. They didn't fill every moment with conversation. Instead, they allowed silence to do what it does best, reveal what mattered. One night, Sandra was leaning against the kitchen doorway, watching Keanu with the kind of gaze that saw him not as a Hollywood figure, not even as a man who had once held back his heart, but as someone who had finally allowed himself to be seen. There was a grace to him now, not because he had become someone else, but because he had stopped hiding. He looked up, catching her stare, and smiled with that subtle expression that always seemed to carry a lifetime of emotion in a single glance. It was that smile, she often told herself, that carried her through the darkest times, smiles she'd replayed in memory long before she had the courage to see them again in person. But with light also came the long shadow of truth. One evening, as they sat watching the rain trail down the windows in Keanu's living room, Sandra broke the calm with a question that had been echoing inside her for weeks. "Do you think we found each other too late?" The question wasn't rooted in doubt. It wasn't regret. It was grief for all the years they'd walked parallel paths without crossing. Keanu took a long breath, as if considering the weight of 1,000 timelines. "No," he said finally, voice steady. "I think we found each other the only way we could have. Any sooner and I wouldn't have been ready. Any later and maybe I wouldn't have survived." She reached for his hand and held it in both of hers, grounding them in the present. "I still sometimes wonder," she said softly, "about the version of us that never happened." I don't, he replied without hesitation. Because that version didn't get this one. The version where I get to wake up and see you without pretending you're not the first person I think about every morning. Sandra smiled, tears welling but not falling. That was Keanu's gift, the ability to turn even the heaviest emotions into something weightless. And yet there remained a delicate ache between them. Not an ache born from lack, but from reverence. When something is cherished for so long in the silence of one's own heart, bringing it into the light can feel terrifying. Every step forward meant risking everything. But they had stopped living cautiously. It was during one of their quiet walks along the cliffs of Big Sur, a place Keanu had fallen in love with during a road trip in his 20s, that they spoke about permanence for the first time. The waves crashed below, the air thick with salt and clarity. Sandra stopped mid-path, her hair whipped gently by the breeze, and looked out at the horizon. "You ever think," she said, "about how much we carry even when we think we've let go?" Keanu joined her, hands tucked into his coat pockets. "All the time, we carry people, places, pain. We carry unfinished sentences and unsent letters, but the trick, I think, is learning how to carry it together." She turned to him. "Would you ever want that, to build something permanent with me?" There was no pause, no hesitation. "Yes," he said simply, and in that word lived every missed moment, every unsaid feeling, every second chance he had prayed for in silence. "Yes, I would." That conversation didn't lead to a ring. It didn't lead to a grand announcement. What it did was open the door to possibility, to shared vision. They talked about homes, not buying one, but creating one, a place that was theirs, where books could pile up and time could stretch. A home not defined by architecture, but by atmosphere. Keanu spoke about planting a small garden, something he'd never done. Sandra promised to paint again, not for a gallery, but for him. They shared dreams like children who had finally been told it was safe to hope again. Then came an unexpected call. A producer they had both once worked with reached out about a quiet indie film, a dual-character drama exploring grief, reconciliation, and timing. The roles were written with them in mind. The script wasn't flashy. It wasn't designed for awards. It was raw, intimate, and deeply reflective of their own journey. At first, they hesitated. Working together again meant exposing their new bond to the public eye. It meant risking the sanctuary they had built. But then Keanu said something that stilled Sandra's nerves. "If this story feels like ours, then maybe telling it together is another way we can honor what we found." And so they agreed. Rehearsals began quietly. There were no press leaks, no marketing gimmicks, just two actors deeply in tune, exploring a story that mirrored so many of the emotions they had lived privately. During filming, the crew often paused, mesmerized by their unspoken rhythm. How Keanu would step into Sandra's space without breaking her flow, how she would reach for his hand in scenes not even written that way, as if the script couldn't contain the truth of their connection. One particular scene, a moment where the characters confessed they loved each other too late, was so emotionally raw that the set fell into a stunned silence afterward. The director, a seasoned veteran, whispered, "I don't think we need another take." That night back at their temporary rental, Sandra sat cross-legged on the floor while Keanu tuned his guitar. He wasn't playing for an audience, just strumming, lost in thought. She watched him for a long time, then quietly said, "I think we're doing something that matters." Keanu looked up, eyes soft. "We are, and this time we're not hiding it." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. Inside, the light stayed on longer than usual, not because they needed it, but because some nights deserve to be remembered in their entirety. A love that chose to stay. The final days of filming felt like the quiet before a new chapter, as if the universe had slowed time just long enough to let Keanu and Sandra fully breathe in the magnitude of what they had created, both on screen and in each other's lives. The film they were working on, bare-boned and unpolished, had become something more than a project. It was a mirror, a chance to revisit all the unspoken truths, all the questions that once lived between them like landmines they had been too afraid to step on. The script gave them language for feelings they'd long buried. But it was in the unscripted moments, in the silences after the cameras cut, the way he reached for her hand when she thought no one was looking, the way she touched his shoulder when his gaze fell too long on the horizon, that their real story was being told. When filming wrapped, they didn't celebrate with a party. There were no red carpets, no magazine exclusives. Instead, they took 3 days off, disconnected from phones, from agents, from questions. They disappeared into a quiet cabin near Lake Tahoe, one of those places that still smelled of pine and old stone fireplaces, where the outside world felt like a distant rumor. It wasn't romantic in the Hollywood sense. There were no rose petals, no champagne flutes. There was just firewood, a fridge stocked with basics, and a view of the lake that made time irrelevant. For 3 days, they existed as two souls who had finally stopped performing and simply allowed themselves to be. Sandra spent the mornings painting, nothing grand, just watercolors that never tried to be perfect. Keanu would wake up to find her seated near the large windows, brush in hand, light in her eyes, and every time he saw her like that, he felt a calm he hadn't known he was missing. In the evenings, they cooked together, their laughter sometimes louder than the music humming from the speaker. They moved like old dancers, familiar steps, shared rhythm, never stepping on each other's toes. At night, they lay beside each other not out of routine, but out of a profound choice. An active choosing, every single moment, to be present in a story they had written not with ink, but with endurance. One evening, as the stars emerged over the water and the logs in the fireplace gave off a slow, amber glow, Keanu turned to her with a gaze that held no hesitation. "I've spent a lot of my life thinking I didn't deserve joy," he began, his voice hushed but certain. "But you've shown me that joy isn't something we earn, it's something we accept, and I want to accept it now, with you." Sandra set her wine glass down and turned toward him, her expression softening into something beyond words. "You don't have to say anything more," she whispered, her hand finding his. "Because I've been waiting not for you to be perfect, not for the right time, but for this version of you, the one who sees that it's okay to be held." He smiled, not the polite, practiced smile of red carpets or press tour, but the one that bloomed from somewhere untouched. And that night in that quiet cabin with no witnesses but the stars and the fire, they made peace with their past by choosing their present. There were no promises carved in stone, no sweeping gestures for the world to admire, just a quiet commitment to stay, to wake up and try, day after day. Months passed, the film was released without fanfare. Critics called it haunting, vulnerable, strangely autobiographical. But those closest to Keanu and Sandra knew it wasn't a performance, it was a confession. And while the film gathered praise and admiration, it was the stillness behind the scenes that mattered more. They bought a home together, not a mansion, not a getaway in the hills, just a modest place with a garden and old oak trees. Sandra planted herbs by the kitchen window. Keanu built bookshelves with his hands. They filled the space not with things, but with reminders of life lived deeply. A record player, a crooked table they refused to fix, a wall covered with candid photos never meant for public eyes. Friends visited and left with the sense that they had witnessed something rare. A relationship built not on spectacle, but on patience, choice, and mutual recognition. One morning, Sandra walked out to the backyard to find Keanu kneeling by the garden, hands in the dirt, planting new lavender bushes. She watched him for a moment, struck by the contrast of a man so often seen as stoic and silent, now surrounded by life, by growth. He looked up, brushing dirt from his cheek, and grinned. "I never thought I'd care this much about plants." She laughed, stepping toward him, crouching beside him. "It's not the plants," she said. "It's what they represent, your finally growing roots." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Only because you stayed long enough for me to believe I could." And just like that, it was clear. They were no longer the characters from Speed, racing against time, or the hopeful souls from the lake house, writing letters across impossible timelines. They were two people who had navigated the hardest parts of life alone, and then, against all odds, found a reason to walk forward together. There was no grand wedding, no tabloid headlines. Just an evening months later when Sandra, in the middle of folding laundry, turned to Keanu and asked, "If we did get married one day, would it change anything?" He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Only the paperwork. I already consider myself yours." And she smiled, not because it was romantic, but because it was real. That was what they had built, something real enough to exist without performance, without approval, without fear. In the end, their love wasn't a fairy tale. It didn't begin with fireworks or end with a fade to black. It was more enduring than that. It was a love that waited, that grew in silence, that chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. It was the kind of love that reminded people not to rush, not to settle, and not to give up on the idea that sometimes life gives you a second chance when you finally become the version of yourself who knows how to receive it. And as Keanu and Sandra stood together one quiet morning, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over their shared horizon, there was no need for words. The story had already been written, in long silences, in steady hands, in hearts that had learned at last how to hold each other.